Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Adam Neal. I'm Assistant Director of the Office of Engaged Learning, and we are back at the Summer Research and Entrepreneurship Symposium. This symposium is part of our year-round programming that supports undergraduate research and entrepreneurship. In addition to educational events like this, our office coordinates funding opportunities for students, including the Engaged Learning Fellowship, undergraduate research assistantships, and the Big Ideas pitch competitions. We also operate the incubator at SMU, which provides meeting and workspace training and mentorship to student, alumni, faculty, and staff entrepreneurs. This symposium is open to anyone, so if you like today's talks, tell your colleagues and friends about our last one, which is next week, when we will hear about sustainability in the fashion industry. So you can find that at the sign up on the same link where you found this. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize my colleagues who couldn't make it today: Jennifer Ebinger, who is director of our office, and Camille McCallum, who is our program specialist for entrepreneurship. Our guest speaker today is Adam Herring, who is the Emily Rich Summers Endowed Professor in Art History at the Meadows School of the Arts. Dr. Herring was trained at Princeton, UC Berkeley, and Yale, and came to SMU in 1997. A specialist in the art of pre-Columbian Americas. In the art of the pre-Columbian Americas, his research interests also include visual theory and semiotics, anthropological and materials critique of visual experience, and the history of the discipline. Herring has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, among others, and he has published 2 books with Cambridge University Press: Art and Writing in the Maya Cities, and Art and Vision in the Inca Empire. Welcome, Dr. Herring.
Hey, thanks, Neil. We've got a nice group here. Is it just us?
Nice, intimate group. Well, some
just
people will pop in a few minutes.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I do appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. And thanks, Adam. Thanks for setting a nice tone. I appreciate it. And I'm glad to share some thoughts with you. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen. There we go. All right, does that look good?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so what I thought I'd do today is, of course, talk about my own work, but try and talk about it in a way that is kind of accessible, right? That is something you can relate to. Because one of the things I find when I teach, one of the responses I get in my student evaluations is, well, he seems very passionate about his material. He seems to really like the material himself, which is, and over the years, over 20 years teaching, that one seems to pop up quite a bit. And I begin to wonder if that's not a kind of proxy for their saying, man, that material is weird, and at least he likes it, and at least we can get a sense that he enjoys it, but it's really strange, really difficult material. And that's certainly my sense of the material. I think that's what they're suggesting. And that's my sense of it. If you're a specialist in pre-Columbian art, these are really distant societies from our own in so many ways, chronologically, geographically, but also in terms of culture, in terms of assumption, in terms of the kinds of social institutions that the art served. These are, by and large, various kinds of divine rulerships across the Americas that produce this very esoteric work that talks about cosmology and the universe. It's pretty abstruse, although it's extremely beautiful as art. That's why it's worth looking at. And it's worth getting to know the artwork and getting to know those places and those traditions, because of course they're part of our shared legacy, part of our shared inheritance of humanity. It's important for its own sake. It's important, of course, because those are the masterpieces, those are the kind of great relics of Latin America and those nations there, and part of their dignity as societies and nations and our neighbors. But it still means, they're pretty far off. This is a photo of Lake Titicaca. I was lucky to go there with my daughter 3 years ago, and it's high. It's 12,500 feet. It's difficult to get to. You're sort of walking around with a headache most of the time. But this is the kind of Vatican, or the ancient Olympus of the Andean world. This is actually this rock that I'm showing you here, is a rock right here This is where the Inca believed the sun was born. This is like the kind of Dome of the Rock or Jerusalem of the Inca world. This is the Holy of Holies. Um, and you'd never really know. It's sort of so off the beaten track. But sharing that kind of material, awareness with students is is a real pleasure. But of course, this is abstruse. It's difficult material. It is not the easiest. So, for instance, here's also from the Titicaca area. This is the a detail of a large monolith that was carved at the site of Tiwanaku, just south of Lake Titicaca. It includes a scene of some kind of solar god rising up out of a mountain lake, as on either side llamas, these guys on either side with the arrows, bear forth hallucinogenic cacti, which will then be used in the rituals overseen by these lords who are leading these llamas with their burden, their packs filled with hallucinogenic cacti. Pretty far out there. And it relates to quite abstruse ideologies of creation and of universal vitality and power, and how those elites at Tiwanaku effectively harnessed it in their regime. And of course, down here we see this beautiful camelid fiber hats that they would wear with winged llamas. That llamas and tropical birds were believed to literally emerge from high lakes like Titicaca. They were sort of born out of them, this kind of cosmic vitality. My point being, all of that's really fascinating and really beautiful as art objects, very absorbing, and it's a little bit distant, right? It's a little bit abstruse and kind of, frankly, kind of difficult when you look at these, elaborate iconography like this in Tiwanaku. It takes a whole career to kind of connect with it, begin to understand it. So I thought for today, I'd focus on something else that kind of is on the global bucket list, and that's Machu Picchu. If you go to tripadvisor.com, Machu Picchu is last time I looked, it's the #1 rated international travel destination in the world. Machu Picchu is the place that everybody wants to go to, whether you're a stockbroker in New York City or a high-tech person in Mountain View or Munich or a student in Hong Kong. Machu Picchu is the place that everybody wants to go, and the place that everybody does go to, of course, until this coronavirus situation we're in now. But Machu Picchu every year has something like 1.6 million people visit it. It's incredibly heavily touristed. And it is a part of a very elaborate travel industry run by Peruvians. I'm sorry. There we go. Very elaborate kind of travel industry that will get you to the site, whether you're a backpacker or a blue chip 5-star world traveler. There are accommodations for you. There is ways to get there, ways to enjoy the site. And it's for this reason that it's heavily touristed, even though it's actually quite remote and rather difficult to get to. Several changes of planes, high altitude, you name it. So I thought I'd just sort of say a few remarks about this place, because it's useful for me as a teacher and as a pre-Columbianist, because it's one of those off the beaten path, abstruse pre-Columbian places that I know everybody's going to get to, or at least everybody wants to get to. So Machu Picchu is not only a beautiful place and a pleasing place to go to, but for me, it's a really useful way to kind of connect with non-specialists and sort of immediately appeal to people. Just really briefly, Machu Picchu, it's a royal Inca estate. It was literally a kind of possession of one of the Inca dynasts late in the history of the Inca Empire, probably built only about 20 or 30 years before the Europeans arrive in the Andes, perhaps 1470 and later. Let me move forward now. And the thing is, when you go to visit Machu Picchu, it is very carefully curated, the site is. It's been cleared away. It's been pathways are through the site, very little signage. It's very kind of light touch in giving access to as many tourists as they do per year. Again, 1.5, 1.6 million a year. And remember, Machu Picchu originally would have been home to maybe 600 people. It's a really small site. This is not like going to ancient Rome or even like an ancient Pompeii. This is like going to ancient, Monticello, or some ancient kind of a retreat villa. That's basically what Machu Picchu was. But when you go there today, it's a really carefully curated place where you really get a sense for this really challenging connection of man and nature, and this kind of in-between place between humanity and the kind of natural landscape around you. That landscape is dramatic and powerful, and it's present everywhere. And the thing about it is that, and I noticed this myself going there many times, and you kind of fall into the spell of Machu Picchu, where you really you feel like you don't think about the Inca, you don't really care about the Inca. You're thinking more about these bigger problems, man, nature, the presence of this kind of drama of the landscape and of the meteorology, the weather, the rainbows that play across the site. The kind of rawness of the architectural and sculptural expression really feels like you're walking in this much kind of broader cosmic landscape that, yes, it's Inca, but you're not really thinking about the Inca. And as you walk through the site, you're not thinking, okay, what did this building do? And what was this part of the site? What function did it serve? Those are usually the questions that we ask when we walk through an archaeological site, whether it's Teotihuacan or Pompeii. We're asking, okay, who lived here and what did these people do? It's not the case in Machu Picchu. You're so bewitched by it and by the kind of spell that it casts in this landscape that it's a different experience entirely. And I found myself feeling this way even as a specialist in the Inca, just sort of transported to this other place and this other set of questions. As well as my students, the students are just sort of walking, and everybody's kind of agog, right? They're just kind of looking around, and it's not the altitude really, it's just, it's the place. And I realized part of what's going on is that when you go to Machu Picchu, you're not so much going to an Inca ruin or a ruined Inca settlement. You're actually going to a kind of perfect ruin, period, full stop. It's like the experience of antiquity. It's the experience of man, nature, civilization, fallen civilization. You're actually touring through what is a whole set of ideological propositions that are advanced first in the late 1700s. And in many ways, the way that we encounter Machu Picchu is the kind of perfect embodiment of that ideology, basically of the Enlightenment and the picturesque. And I'll show you what I mean. Here is a leaf from Alexander von Humboldt's volume on the natural history of South America. Alexander von Humboldt, a Prussian intellectual and scientist who tours South America in about 1802, comes back and publishes a lavish volume in 1810, which really sets the stage, whets the appetite of Europe for the New World and for the landscapes, for the minerals, for the flora, the fauna, and the ancient civilizations. And he actually doesn't get to Machu Picchu. He actually doesn't get down to Peru, but he's active in the highlands on his travels. He goes to the highlands of Ecuador, and he's very eager to visit Inca ruins there, and he does. And he describes one Inca ruin that he visited in highland Ecuador in 1802 in his book of 1810. And he says, this rustic seat would not be out of place in the gardens of Ermenonville or Richmond. And the prince who chose this site was not insensitive to the beauties of nature. He belonged to a people whom we do not have the right to call barbarians. Basically, Humboldt is comparing this to a garden park of the late 18th century. He's saying it's the kind of perfect garden park. And actually, if you look at this plate that illustrated that passage in his book on the left, illustrating Inca Shungana, that site in Highland, Ecuador. And if you look at it next to contemporary views, contemporary illustrations of those French and English picturesque gardens, you see basically all the same elements are there, right? You see here, this is Hermenonville, the place where Rousseau, the great French Enlightenment writer about man and nature. This is his tomb, and you literally see the same elements, this kind of deep views, the dramatic atmosphere, the presence of nature, this kind of untrammeled nature there, and these tourists sort of being part of it. So you literally see the same language being applied that Humboldt and his illustrators are using, sort of deploying it. And you can even push it further. Here, I just pulled this down from Flickr. You know, I went to Flickr, and there's all kinds of tourists from all over the world post their pictures on Flickr. And here's a great photo of Machu Picchu that someone posted. And if you actually look at the kind of what it depicts here on site at Machu Picchu and the kind of pictorial language, the staging, once again, it's the same image as Humboldt is producing in his book about 200 years ago. And it's the same, even right down to the pair of llamas, right here, right in the foreground. And you sort of look past them into this deeper landscape with this dramatic atmosphere and mountainous features. It is remarkable that actually what we're doing in visiting Machu Picchu is it's as if we're stepping back into a kind of Enlightenment era view, a landscape view, or into an Enlightenment era picturesque landscape garden. And actually, so much of what we're enjoying when we're at Machu Picchu is, yes, the Inca history very much, but also our own, that Western history of kind of landscape architecture and of sublime experience in a landscape. And I began to realize, okay, that's actually what's going on. That's why I'm actually, even as a specialist, when I go to Machu Picchu, I'm not thinking about the Inca. I'm actually thinking about, man, nature, society, rise and fall. Am I going to fall? The kind of danger of this nature is so powerful that I could slip and fall and lose my own life, and I need to be careful. I mean, these are all straight out of the playbook, the kind of picturesque garden and the discourse of the sublime in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So that's just sort of prefatory remarks. But Machu Picchu has this fascinating history of reception. I mean, there's a whole series of questions you can ask as to how did we get here? How did Machu Picchu, this ruined Inca settlement, how did it come to be posed this way for us, the visitors? How is it that we not just consume it this way, but want to consume it this way and feel actually very satisfied? It's a very powerful experience when you go there. It's a successful site and destination for international tourists to go to. Everybody raves about it. They go to TripAdvisor and say how great it was. It works as the kind of perfect ruin. And we can sort of talk about the kind of history of Machu Picchu's reception. And key in this history is Hiram Bingham, this North American gentleman and kind of scholar. What would you call he's a gentleman / scholar in the early years of the 20th century. He's most famous for quote unquote rediscovering Machu Picchu. And he actually does make the trip there, and he and a very large crew work very hard to, they effectively trek into this part of the Andes and talk with local people and receive information that there is a ruined settlement at the top of a ridge over there, and they make it. And Hiram Bingham is fascinating because what he does is not so much excavate and document as he and his crew set about to photographing. That Hiram Bingham is really aware that the number one thing he needs to do is to document this place and get the news out. He is Machu Picchu's, not so much its discoverer, but its publicist. And he has with him photographic apparatus, this kind of old-fashioned, large format photography. let me go back real quick. Large format photography, and he takes absolutely gorgeous photos like this one. This is a fold out from National Geographic magazine in 1913. And he's actually so successful at doing this, these beautiful fold out photographs that are very detailed and very skillfully composed. But he not only successfully publicizes Machu Picchu, the site, and himself, Hiram Bingham, as an explorer, but he actually establishes the kind of publisher's playbook for National Geographic itself, basically the kind of model of National Geographic, the kind of explorer, glossy photo spread, only the best photography, exotic places, difficult journeys made to get to there. That's all that playbook is established in these very early publications by Hiram Bingham, about 1913, of Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu makes National Geographic magazine into the kind of international publishing leviathan that it is even today in the era of digital media. Okay, let me go forward. And there's another reason, more local, that there is the Machu Picchu as patrimony of humanity, as an exemplar of Enlightenment values and experience. And that has to do with very local politics of Peru and how the Peruvian middle and upper classes relate to their indigenous majority population, especially in the highlands. And this is a stereo view photograph from about 1900 of the Central Plaza in Cuzco. As I say, it's taken about 1900, at which time, as for the previous few hundred years under Spanish administration, that main plaza in Cuzco was a marketing place for indigenous, mostly women, to sell primarily their agricultural produce. It was where, it was like a potato market, and potatoes and onions, local foodstuffs that would be part of the local economy, and local people would come in and sell their wares. And it made for a problem in modernizing Peru, the sort of sense of these very backward people intruding on the most public, most visible, the most monumental space of new industrial Cuzco, and kind of bringing with them these sort of rural products that were sort of, unfortunate, lamentable, and backward. There was a real sense of shame that local middle class and upper class people had, people who spoke good Spanish, people who wore starched collars and waxed mustaches. The professional world of modernizing Cuzco, this is not what they wanted to see in their city. And actually, there's a whole social history in this part of Peru of effectively that those middle classes, those people who have the education, who are the businessmen, who are the politicians, who are the landowners, who are the movers and shakers, most of them Latin speaking and very much oriented toward Lima and toward the international kind of world of politics and finance. They don't want to see this version of indigeneity on their main plaza. And in fact, there's even a kind of slogan that many of them coin. It's Incas sí, Indios no. We don't want Indians, but Incas, yes. We're happy to see the Incas. And there's this kind of difficult negotiation that is gone about in Peru over the course of the 20th century about how to present the indigenous past, how to present the Inca to the outside world. And in general, the choice has been to present them as if they're something like the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks, kind of high civilization now disappeared. But they're not Indians, they're not property, they're not the legacy of local indigenous people, who of course are descended directly, both genetically and culturally, from those Inca times, Inca cultural institutions. Very much those indigenous communities are something like survivors of that Inca tradition, although now on a kind of village level, reduced to very, very difficult economic circumstances on the far edges of Peruvian society. So part of the reason that when we go to Machu Picchu is it doesn't feel like a specific Inca place is because that's part of a much larger program in Peru itself of kind of working through this difficult issue of how Peru's progressive, technologically savvy, middle and upper classes relate to people whom they regard as backward, as something much more like hillbillies, people that are holding the progress of the nation back with their indigenous culture and their simplicity and their the danger they pose to the progress of the nation just by their very backwardness. So that's also part of, the Peru is also presenting Machu Picchu as this kind of cultureless place as much as we do ourselves. Now, there's plenty more that I could talk about. I know I'm just about at the end of my presentation, just to sort of prepared remarks. And Adam, should I stop there and stop screen sharing so I can take some questions?
Sure. So everybody, feel free to just unmute and chime in with a question. We have a small group today, so you don't need to raise your hand, but if you'd prefer to type it out to me in the chat, I can read it. I can read it off. But what questions do we have?
And if they don't pour in, I can just keep talking. Oh, I can talk and talk. They pay me to talk and I can talk. But so if there are no questions that roll in, I can just keep.
Yeah, we got a question.
I have a question.
Very good. Thank you.
This is coming from how people in the United States dealt with this issue. And Thomas Jefferson invoked this rationale that, this kind of lost tribe thesis, taking it from the Old Testament as a way, again, to separate the people in the past who can be cherished and disconnect, as you're saying. I thought that was really interesting, disconnected from any Native Americans or indigenous people of the present. So I don't know if that's coming from your perspective, maybe not from a biblical perspective, but if that's kind of the same thing that's at work here.
Yeah, well, it's all tied together, right? The amazing thing about this is that kind of high educated interest, that kind of scientific interest in the indigenous past. So all those paths lead back to the Enlightenment. And yes, Thomas Jefferson, one of the great exemplars. Jefferson, who consumed Humboldt's volumes greedily, right? Had them in his, literally those very same images I showed you from Humboldt's publication of 1810. They very much inspire Jefferson. So there is always a kind of common thread there, and it works its way out in very different ways over the years and sort of within, different political contexts, right? For instance, today, some of the greatest archaeologists, as individual practitioners and as a program are the Mormons. BYU has one of the great New World archaeological programs in this country. They're fantastic archaeologists, particularly in the Maya area. And of course, that's informed by Mormon scripture, Mormon doctrine, that the indigenous people of the New World are the lost tribe of Israel. And the BYU and the Mormons have historically been very interested in the Maya because the Maya actually write. They have a writing system that is very complicated, very expressive, and that they use quite a bit. Unlike the people of ancient South America who don't have writing systems, don't prefer to use them or develop them. And even in Mesoamerica and Mexico, the Maya writing system is by far the most elaborate, the most intricate. So it's to the Maya area that BYU has sort of, made a beeline, effectively, hoping in their heart of hearts to find God knows what, tablets, things like this, ancient Mormon scripture. I mean, I think that they believe that, but you see, that's a very particular kind of American story that relates to our history, but it all kind of ties back to that Enlightenment moment. In Peru, it's a whole separate set of questions, and Peru has its own history of a kind of confrontation with indigeneity. And I'm going on a little bit here, but I'll just allow myself to do that. One of the differences between Peru and Mexico, and Americans, when we think about ancient civilizations in the New World, Mexico offers our template. It offers our basic playbook for how modern states relate to ancient complex societies. And in Mexico, of course, after the revolution of the 19 teens, after the kind of leftist forces prevail in that revolution, they institute a kind of celebratory attitude, a kind of recuperation and a celebration and an incorporation of especially the ancient Aztec into the kind of state ideology. They're sort of celebrating the Aztec as a kind of ancient people, but also as a living people. That the Aztec are alive today in the multi-ethnic, indigenous majority Mexican population, and that they ennoble that population. That's a very particular Mexican story, and it's a story that does not happen in Peru. And in fact, in Peru, the situation is very different. And in this same Enlightenment period, one of the phenomena that happens in the 1780s, 1790s is we get a whole series of native revolts in the highlands, most famously the Tupac Amaru rebellion, which is a very successful native army led by a Quechua-speaking native nobleman who leads very successful military campaigns in the area basically between Cusco and Lake Titicaca. And they're able to hold off a number of larger armies sent up from Lima to put this down. But it becomes a kind of scandal for the elite down in Lima, the losses they suffer and how much work it takes to subdue Tupac Amaru is very successful. But this legacy of native rebellion as something that threatens the state, that native power, especially native power of the highlands, this Quechua-speaking people, they are not part of the state. They don't push the state forward. They actually threaten it. They threaten it either through rebellion, through outright military opposition, or they threaten it through their own backwardness, their refusal to be dragged into the future along with the rest of Peru. So this history also prepares a kind of wariness in especially in Lima, where all the people and the money is, toward highland indigenous society, a sort of sense that, these people are, they're not us. They're a kind of problem in our state building project. They're a problem in our progress and our economic prosperity. And they're certainly not to be celebrated. And it's a very particular Peruvian story, which again is very distinct from either the Mormons in Utah or the Mexicans in Mexico City. But these things have a way of playing out in very distinct ways, depending on what political circumstance you're talking about. I know that was long-winded and I apologize, but it's very interesting to me. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And I'll just add one other weird twist when you were talking. The other thing I've written about is the way in which in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the people, the American version of the Highlands, and we could apply this to the Scottish Highlands, the way they get romanticized, but the American version was the Appalachians, who then are seen as this, again, this lost, perfect people, like back to Chaucer's England. And they are also seen as people who are backward. They are going against the grain of modernity. I mean, it's really curious because it's like echoing many of the things that you're saying, that same kind of narrative.
Yeah, and I mentioned, hillbilly. I mean, that's my impression. Very, and this is also the case in Central America, in say Honduras, Guatemala. There really is a sense, if you work there as a North American archaeologist or academic, the people whom you work with tend to be those middle class, technologically savvy, the científicos, right? Those progressive people who want to push their nations forward. But even they have a real sense of kind of difference and distance from local people and from especially local indigenous people. And so you never really get too close to them unless you're actually a really dedicated anthropologist doing ethnography. And you decide, like, look, I am going to spend time in those villages. I am going to learn those languages. I'm going to take the time it takes and the effort it takes, basically, to get away from my wonderful, polite, generous handlers in the capital who take such good care of me too. But it takes work to get away from the preconceptions and honestly, and the kind of local bigotry that those middle and upper class people that are typically the people that we interact with as American visitors and academics have for their own peasantry in the Highlands. But the sense that they're almost regarded as hillbillies, and that would be my impression of sort of looking for a comparison. That's one that I just sort of, it comes to my mind. So I wasn't thinking of it literally, but it does work. It's remarkable what you're saying.
Again, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
What other questions do we have? They can expand on these topics or about art history in general.
Oh, art history in general.
Well, I guess, yeah, could maybe give a little, like, basically, how would you go about a career in art history? How about we go there?
That's look, that's a good question. And how would you start a career in art history? I would say you start by going to every museum you can as often as you can. You go to every gallery opening you can as often as you can. You enjoy the art. You just start living it and breathing it. And it's that way that you kind of cultivate your own awareness of the art, your own facility with distinguishing the different kinds of art. It's a way to just kind of deepen your understanding of what art is and also what you enjoy looking at. Because, like any academic pursuit, it takes a long time. It's a long road. And you have to make, not terrible sacrifices, certainly, I wouldn't say that. But it's a long road, and you will have to be willing to make sacrifices to move to wherever there's a job when the time comes. It's part of what we do in the humanities and social sciences. But it's important to really know what gets you up in the morning. And if you're pursuing a career in art history or museums, really it starts with the art. You have to love the art. And it's important to love all art, but also to know what art it is that you particularly love. What is the art that gets you up in the morning? And the best way to do that is just to look at art just as much as you can, just to get to know it, to understand it, to put it in place. I know my members of my family have been Peace Corps people going back a couple generations now. And I know one of the things they tell people that would like to go on the Peace Corps, well, what should I do to go, to be qualified for the Peace Corps? And the answer is something like, you need to read the New York Times and the Washington Post every day. That's if you want to know about international relations, people around the world. The Peace Corps is effectively, it's a diplomatic post. It's very important for this country's relationship with people all over the world. So you got to learn about world affairs and about how the U.S. relates to the world. You got to read the newspaper every day, read the Post and read the New York Times every single day. And that way you'll be prepared after a lifetime, your teenage and college years doing that. That's how to do it. I would say something like that for art history is you start with just going to see as much art as you can. See it locally, see it at your local museum. One of the things about Dallas is that we have wonderful collections across the board. We're really a great art town. One of the great art towns between the coasts. And depending what you're talking about, we have some of the best art between the coasts or on either coast. So go to see the work to begin with. And look, when you get to college, get to know your profs, bug them, go to office hours, talk to them about, about their research, about what they do, but also talk to them about what they love. Get to know about what animates their interest in the discipline, what makes them excited. I'd start with that. And you know what? If you go into a career as an art historian or a museum curator, or look, if you become a lawyer or a you know, or whatever, a Peace Corps volunteer, you know, whatever it is that you wind up doing, that's always a great education. You know, looking at art, it's always art or music. You know, Adam knows this. He's a musician himself, right? It's a wonderful education in and of itself. No matter what you do, it will make your life better. It will make you enjoy life, make you, you know, a more sentient, a more thinking person, and make you happier no matter what you do. So it's not a sunk cost. It's not a waste of time for you. All that time spent in front of art objects and pictures in museums. Is that a good start?
I think so. I guess maybe a follow-up. How did you get interested in the art that you're interested in? Like, what were some of your early experiences that made you say, "Oh, I want to study Inca art, Mayan art, that kind of thing"?
That's a great question. I don't have a really don't have a perfect answer. It's something to do with, I grew up in California. My parents are children of the 60s. You know, they're very, my dad's an architect. So they're artsy people. So they, you know, encouraged an interest in art, you know, actively, but also just by their own interests. And, you know, you follow the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, you know, in situations like that. But I also, when I got older, you know, my parents were, I think they understood that, you know, raising children, raising boys is not easy. And they were artsy people, but also this raising boys business is tough. And they look for a school that I think they look for a good school that would sort of lock me up for the most hours a day, my brother and me. So off we went to Catholic school, to the monastery school nearby, where they sort of, you know, ran us ragged for, you know, a good 8, 9, 10 hours a day, and we came home good and tired. But also at that school, because it was in California, I grew up in California, and because it was that kind of monastery school, it had this tie to the Catholic Church. There were a lot of kids from Latin America who were border kids there. And I actually met a lot of kids from Central America, from Mexico, northern Mexico, Mexico City, some kids from Chile and Brazil, lots of kids from the Philippines and Hong Kong. So it was very international because it had these borders from all over in this, you know, in this place that people wanted to go to, and it was very international for its time, California. So I made good friends with a lot of my Latin American classmates, and you know, I became very interested in where they're from. They're interesting people. They were cosmopolitan people, and they were very generous people who, you know, would invite me to come and visit them. And I was lucky enough to go visit friends in Mexico and Central America, and to, you know, to go to those places, you know, not just as a tourist, but as a friend, as someone accompanied by a local. And look, the art there is just really astounding. Like Mexico City, there's no greater art town than Mexico City. That museum of anthropology and culture in Mexico City is transformative. Certainly was for me, but also other places around Mexico. You know, I spoke about the Andes in Peru here, but really, you know, Mexico, we're so fortunate that it's close to us. It really is. Mexico is like Italy, right? It has this sort of sense, this depth of culture that expresses itself in the architecture, in the sculpture, all these different media of art, in the food, in the language. It is just bigger and deeper and more powerful culturally than almost any other nation in Latin America. And again, as I say this as a specialist now in Peru, right? Mexico is really special, and I was lucky enough to go there very early in my life as a high school student and really be impressed with those facts that, you know, if you want to study culture, you want to be aware of culture, and cultures that are challenging, cultures that are difficult and hard to understand, but that are worth it, worth that investment. This is where it is. So actually I found that when I went off to college and studied art history, well, almost all the courses I took were in Western art history. They were, medieval art of the West. They were Italian Renaissance. They were modernism in Paris. They're the kind of typical art history courses for the time, very focused on the Western tradition. That in itself, of course, is a great education in Western art, but also in culture and how to think. But when it came time for me to do my own graduate research and do my own writing and thinking, what contribution did I want to make when the time came? My interest was turned back to the indigenous civilizations of the New World, to specifically to the Maya and more recently to the Inca, because that's where, for me, the problems were most pressing and most unanswered. The material is the least worked over relative to, again, medieval France or Italian Renaissance painting. That's great material. It's fascinating. It's beautiful. It's worth it. And goodness, all of you should go see the Capodimonte show at the Kimball right now. It's just astounding. If you want to see great Italian painting, great Spanish painting, go check it out. It's just wonderful. So I still love that material too, but for my own research, I just found that it was the Latin American material that was just a lot more powerful, a lot more engaging as a problem to spend one's career trying to puzzle through. Anything else I can address for you?
Yeah, I mean, I can keep asking questions, but we're here for y'all.
I could tell you more about Machu Picchu if you like. Have I got slides. I mean, that's another possibility.
And you can certainly raise your hand to say yes, or. Well, I guess one more thing I'd like to ask. In your bio, I saw that some of your research interests are about visual theory and semiotics, and you talked about landscape and environment and that kind of thing. I wanted to know maybe how those theories fit into some of your research and your travels to Machu Picchu.
Sure. That's a great question, and that's okay. So one of the things that we're taught to do in art history is to look at very specific media of artistic expression. Very specific things, objects, material goods in very specific places, i.e. paintings in museums. That's what we're taught to look at. We're taught this is art, and everything else is kind of outside the frame. Once you're outside that kind of gilded frame of the Baroque painting, that's the not art world. But inside that gilded frame, that's art, and that's where you look. Put your attention right here in between the frame. That has worked for art historical and aesthetic criticism for a good 400 years. That's sort of how we think about art. This very kind of bounded, very finite understanding, which is the case, but it's rather monocular, right? There's a kind of sense that you're not really seeing the bigger picture. And indeed, so much of modern and contemporary art is about exploding that kind of sense of confinement, that aesthetic ambition and artistic expression only takes place on the object that's placed on a plinth, or the painting that's within a frame, or something, whatever it is, inside a museum. But that otherwise, well, you're not in the realm of art. And so much modern contemporary art is sort of questioning that very thing. But one of the things that pre-Columbian work lets you do is to ask those same kind of questions, kind of explode that frame and think much more broadly about what aesthetic practice is, what it means to make kind of meaningful and also enigmatic and what we call poetic form that can be read and understood on many different levels, that communicates many different ways and communicates many different things at the same time. That's basically what art does. And that also has a kind of self-consciousness to it, that has an awareness that this is part of the project, is that kind of questioning of what aesthetics is and what it's saying and what's the answer. But pre-Columbian art, in that it's a very much a collection of distinct traditions that are only, we only call it pre-Columbian art because it's a kind of way of saying it's not us, right? It's not our tradition, but there are in fact many traditions. So there's a great deal of diversity among those traditions in what they're doing, how they're expressing their work. But also it offers an opportunity to think as an art historian sort of beyond, think outside the box, right? Think outside the kind of aesthetic confinement that so often our own tradition imposes on us and imposes on our thinking. So things like the Inca are especially interesting in this way because they're really hard. The Inca don't write, there's no writing system. The Maya are really interesting because they have a very elaborate writing system, and they would write down, who their patrons were. Lord Firepaw, AD 806, March 23rd, this kind of thing. It's really fine-grained historical information. The Maya would write it down, so you can write political histories, you can write the stories of dynasties and of kings, you can talk about their gods and their conflicts in really granular detail. The Maya are fascinating that way, and it's all because of their writing system. They wrote it down, and we can now basically read it pretty well. The Inca, not so much. The Inca didn't use a writing system. They used instead very elaborate mnemonic systems. They had kind of court memorizers. At the king's elbow would be the guy whose job it was to memorize everything going on and to commit it to memory. And that was his job as a counselor and as an administrator. They would have literally whole ministries full of these guys. And as well as poets who would then spin that information into songs and myths and long kind of days-long stories. But of course, those memory specialists are the first people that the Spanish go after, right? So they immediately disappear, and they along with their disappearance is all that information that they had stored, all that particular information, all that kind of deep store of cultural knowledge is lost. Which means that when we look at the art, which doesn't have any writing, doesn't have that information, you have to piece things together. The thing about Inca art is there are actually not only no writing, but very few images. They're much more interested in pattern than images. There are a few, it's not like they're against images, that is, things like representations of particular political figures or gods. There are a few, but only a very few. It's not the interest of their artistic tradition. Instead, they're much more interested in the kind of cosmology of the material they're working with and the kind of interaction of their objects with the kind of larger environmental cosmological processes that they came from. So things like gold, what is gold? But rather it's a kind of materialized sunlight that is sort of miraculously found in these kind of mines that they would liken to. They would use the same term for a gold mine that they would use for a productive cornfield. It was like sort of miraculously bringing forth this kind of solar energy from the ground. So things like this, it's really tough and kind of difficult, and you have to think broadly, and you have to think a little bit loosely about bigger questions. So the Inca are a people that I came to, a tradition I came to kind of late in my career as a kind of challenge. It's sort of something, the degree of difficulty is very high. And it's something that I was interested in just because it was an interesting challenge. And in many ways, a lot harder and a lot trickier and a lot more engaging than the Maya had been, because so many of those basic questions are answered for you by the Maya themselves with their written texts.
Yeah, that really is an interesting way to think about it. And I think more modern artists in the Western tradition, or I guess everywhere, are thinking more about how materials, commenting on the material itself. So it's interesting to go back that far and see all the culture thinking of it in that way.
Yeah, I think everything kind of interconnected or disconnected, or the task is to reconnect. There's a lot of really interesting gender problems you can engage with, the role of women in those societies. especially for the Inca, a ruthlessly patriarchal society, really a society of male dynasts and generals, but who have a very particular regard for the potential of the female gender, you know, as a kind of complement, at least a complement to the male, and a necessary complement for kind of propagation of life. And the Inca state has this fascinating tendency to kind of switch genders depending on what context you're talking about. When the Inca state is at war, it's a kind of angry male. But when it is at peace and when it is trying to reward its clients and its servants, it's a giving mother, it's a giving wife, and very explicitly so in their rhetoric. So there's all kinds of fascinating things about art, about gender, about society, about memory, right? Just talking about those memory specialists, you know, it's really mind-bending. One of the great discoveries, I'll just sort of sidebar, one of the great work that's being done now is on these stringed documents that the Inca would produce. They're called quipus. Spanish are very kind of bemused by these things, but they're these kinds of balls of string with knots in them. And those memory specialists I mentioned, they would use those as sort of like reminders, as mnemonic devices that would help them remember this massive information they were charged with committing to their mind. And the whole tradition of these stringed documents that are sort of scattered around Inca archaeological sites and have been collected higgledy-piggledy by various, you know, travelers, explorers, archaeologists, and there are museums all over the world. But one of the really interesting areas of research in the Inca, not mine, but colleagues of mine, is sort of looking at those stringed documents and trying to literally reverse engineer them. Like, how does this thing work logically, as not as writing, but as a kind of an information encoding device, a device that by helping those specialists remember, it does encode memory, it does encode facts and figures. And it's been one of the preoccupations of several important scholars in the field is literally documenting all those surviving quipus, understanding how they're put together physically, trying to distinguish the real from the fake. We actually have, there's at least one Baroque fake quipu that is created in Jesuit circles in Rome in the mid-17th century that purports to be a quipu, and it isn't. And it purports to tell a lost Inca myth in an accompanying book that the Jesuit, a particular Jesuit college in Rome, that these Jesuit intellectuals, they sort of cook up in the mid-1600s. It really sort of threw the field for a loop in the 1990s when this came forward from an aristocratic collection in Bologna. It was like, well, is this thing for real? The answer was no, it isn't. But most of the quipus that do survive are in fact numeric. They're about helping those specialists remember numbers, facts, and figures. It's sort of the IRS records, those guys, because of course the Inca, like any empire, they're concerned with the bottom line and with, you know, money and goods and service. And that's most of what the quipus are actually recording, is sort of amounts of things. Yeah. Base 10 numerological system. Yeah.
All right. So we have time for one or two short questions. Y'all have been very quiet, but going once and twice. No takers. All right. Well, Adam, thanks so much for this talk. I hope you all enjoyed it. I thought it was very interesting. Again, I'm Adam Neal. I'm Assistant Director of the Office of Engaged Learning here at SMU, and we have one more of these summer symposiums, same time, 4 o'clock Central next week. We'll be talking with Dr. Mary Ann Cairns, who's in the anthropology department, and a guest from Project Runway talking about sustainability in the fashion industry. So I hope you'll join us then. Thanks again, Adam, and Have a good day and good weekend, everybody.
Okay, it was a pleasure. Thanks very much, Adam. Thanks to everybody. Appreciate it.
Have a good one. Bye.